The morning sun cast long shadows across the outdoor shooting range at Camp Meadowbrook, a summer training facility nestled in the hills of Montana. Sergeant Williams stood with his arms crossed, watching as another trainee missed the target completely. The bullet whizzed harmlessly into the dirt berm behind the wooden target boards. "That's 15 misses in a row," Sergeant Williams announced, his voice carrying across the range. The group of 22 young trainees stood in an uneven line, some shifting nervously from foot to foot, others staring at their boots in embarrassment. This was supposed to be the final shooting assessment for the Junior Marksman Program, a prestigious summer course that attracted teenagers from across the country. Each participant had dreams of military careers, law enforcement, or competitive shooting. They had spent 3 weeks learning about firearm safety, breathing techniques, stance, and sight alignment. Today would determine who would receive their certification and who would go home empty-handed. "Any sharpshooters here?" Sergeant Williams questioned, his steel gray eyes scanning the group. His weathered face showed no emotion, but inside he was genuinely concerned. In his 25 years of instruction, he had never seen such a consistently poor performance from an entire group. The trainees had been attempting to hit a standard bullseye target at 100 yards using precision rifles. The requirement was simple: 5 shots with at least 3 hitting within the scoring rings. So far, not a single participant had managed even one successful hit. Marcus Henderson, a tall boy from Texas who had boasted about hunting since age 12, stepped forward confidently. "I'll give it another shot, Sergeant," he said, adjusting his baseball cap. Marcus had been the most vocal member of the group, constantly sharing stories about the deer he had taken and the trophies on his bedroom wall. Marcus approached the firing line, took his position, and carefully aimed. The crack of the rifle echoed across the valley. The spotter next to the target shook his head and pointed to the dirt. Another miss. "That's impossible," Marcus muttered, checking his rifle scope. "This equipment must be off." Sergeant Williams had already verified all the equipment that morning. The rifles were zeroed perfectly, the ammunition was match grade, and the weather conditions were ideal. Light winds, clear visibility, and comfortable temperatures. These were optimal shooting conditions. Jennifer Kim from California stepped up next. She had been quiet throughout the program but had shown excellent technical knowledge during classroom sessions. Her stance was textbook perfect as she settled into position. She controlled her breathing exactly as taught, squeezed the trigger smoothly, and followed through properly. The shot rang out. "Miss!" called the spotter. Jennifer's face crumpled with disappointment. She had been sure that shot would hit. Everything felt right, and she had applied every technique they had learned. One by one, more trainees attempted the seemingly impossible task. David from Michigan, Sarah from Oregon, both twins from Florida, and Tom from New York. Each approach was met with the same result. The targets remained untouched, while the dirt berm behind them collected more and more bullets. Sergeant Williams began to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with his teaching methods. He had guided hundreds of young people through this program over the years. While not everyone became an expert marksman, this level of failure was unprecedented. The group's confidence was completely shattered. Whispered conversations broke out among the trainees. Some questioned whether the targets were at the right distance. Others wondered if the rifles were somehow defective. The atmosphere grew tense with frustration and disappointment. Standing at the back of the group, almost hidden behind the taller trainees, was Emma Rodriguez. She was 17 years old, small in stature, and had barely spoken more than a few words during the entire 3-week program. While others shared stories about their shooting experience or military family backgrounds, Emma simply listened and observed. Emma came from a modest family in rural Colorado. Her father worked as a mechanic, and her mother was a school teacher. She had no background with firearms, no hunting stories to share, and no family military tradition. She had applied for the program simply because she was curious about marksmanship and thought it might be an interesting challenge. Throughout the training, Emma had been a model student. She arrived early, stayed late to practice dry firing exercises, and took detailed notes during every lecture. When other trainees were joking around or complaining about the physical demands of the program, Emma was quietly absorbing every piece of information. Her instructors had noticed her dedication, but she showed no exceptional talent during the preliminary exercises. Her scores on written tests were excellent, and her understanding of ballistics and wind reading was surprisingly sophisticated for someone with no experience. However, when it came to actual shooting, she performed about average during the practice sessions. Sergeant Williams looked at his watch. They had been at the range for 2 hours and time was running short. The bus would arrive at 3 p.m. to transport the trainees back to the main facility for the graduation ceremony and departure. At this rate, none of them would be graduating. "Listen up," he called to the group. "We have 1 more hour before we need to pack up. I want each of you to take one final attempt. This is your last chance to qualify." The second round of attempts began with renewed determination, but yielded the same disappointing results. The trainees were now visibly frustrated, with some on the verge of tears. 3 weeks of training, thousands of dollars in program fees, and dreams of marksmanship certification were slipping away. As the failures mounted, Sergeant Williams noticed something interesting. While the other trainees became increasingly agitated and rushed their shots, Emma remained calm and composed. She watched each attempt carefully, studying not just the shooter's technique, but also observing the wind indicators, noting the slight variations in shooting positions, and paying attention to details that others were too frustrated to notice. Emma had always been an observer rather than a participant. Throughout her life, she had learned more by watching and thinking than by jumping into action. While her classmates in school were quick to raise their hands or speak out, Emma preferred to listen, analyze, and understand before acting. Her approach to the marksmanship program had been no different. During the 3 weeks of training, she had created a mental database of everything she observed. She noted which techniques worked best for different body types, how various breathing patterns affected accuracy, and how small adjustments in stance could have significant impacts on shot placement. Most importantly, Emma had been observing something that everyone else had missed. While focused on their own performance and frustrations, the other trainees had failed to notice a pattern in the misses. Emma had been quietly tracking where each shot was going, and she was beginning to understand what was happening. The wind at the range was more complex than it appeared. While the flags near the shooting line indicated light and variable winds, Emma had noticed that the vegetation at different distances suggested a more complicated wind pattern. There was a subtle crosswind that was stronger at the target line than at the firing line. Additionally, Emma had observed that the morning sun was creating heat mirage effects that were affecting bullet trajectory in ways that the other shooters were not compensating for. The combination of these factors meant that the point of aim needed to be adjusted significantly from what the basic training had taught them. As the final attempts continued to fail, Emma felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had always been uncomfortable being the center of attention, but she also possessed a quiet confidence in her analytical abilities. She knew she had identified the problem, and she believed she could solve it. The question was whether she would have the courage to step forward and apply what she had learned. With only a few trainees left to attempt their final shots, Emma realized that her turn was approaching. The moment that would change everything was just minutes away. The atmosphere at the shooting range had become thick with tension and disappointment. Sergeant Williams looked at his clipboard and realized that only 3 trainees remained who had not taken their final attempt. The prospect of sending an entire group home without certification was becoming a very real possibility. Rachel Morrison from Ohio stepped up to the firing line. She had been one of the more promising students during the early weeks of training, showing natural stability and good hand-eye coordination. Her father was a police officer, and she had grown up around firearms, though she had never done precision shooting at this distance. Rachel settled into her shooting position with obvious nervousness. Her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the rifle. The weight of everyone watching, combined with the pressure of seeing every other person fail, was clearly affecting her concentration. "Take your time," Sergeant Williams encouraged, though his voice carried less confidence than usual. "Remember your breathing, natural point of aim, and smooth trigger squeeze." Rachel tried to steady herself, but her breathing was shallow and rapid. She took aim at the target, held her breath too long, and pulled the trigger with a jerky motion. The shot cracked across the range. "Miss low and left," called the spotter. Rachel's shoulders sagged in defeat. She had been so certain that her background and family connection to law enforcement would give her an advantage. Instead, she was just another disappointment in what was becoming the worst day in Sergeant Williams's instructional career. Brandon Mills from Arizona was the second-to-last trainee. He had joined the program hoping it would improve his chances of getting into the military academy. His grades were excellent, and his physical fitness was outstanding, but he knew that marksmanship skills would be crucial for his military aspirations. Brandon approached the firing line with determination. He had been analyzing the failures of his fellow trainees and had convinced himself that the problem was overthinking. He decided to trust his instincts and shoot more instinctively rather than getting bogged down in technical details. This approach proved to be just as unsuccessful as all the careful, technical attempts that had preceded it. Brandon's shot went wide to the right, missing the target completely. He stared at the target in disbelief, then looked back at Sergeant Williams with confusion and frustration written across his face. "I don't understand," Brandon said, his voice cracking slightly. "I did everything exactly like we practiced. My natural point of aim felt perfect." Sergeant Williams was beginning to question his own abilities as an instructor. He had run through the checklist multiple times in his mind. Equipment was functioning properly, range safety was optimal, and the fundamentals being demonstrated by the trainees were technically sound. Yet somehow 21 consecutive attempts had resulted in 21 complete failures. The pressure was mounting not just on the remaining shooters, but on Sergeant Williams himself. This was his program, his reputation, and his responsibility. If none of these young people could successfully complete the qualification, questions would be asked about his methods and competency. Emma Rodriguez was now the only trainee who had not attempted her final shot. All eyes turned to her as she stood quietly at the back of the group. Some of the other trainees looked at her with expressions of sympathy, assuming she would meet the same fate as everyone else. "Emma," Sergeant Williams called, trying to keep any hint of desperation out of his voice. "You're up." Emma had been using the time during the other attempts to finalize her observations and calculations. While everyone else was focused on the immediate disappointment of each missed shot, she had been building a comprehensive understanding of the environmental factors affecting bullet trajectory. She had noticed that the mirage effect was stronger now than it had been during the morning practice sessions. The heat rising from the ground was creating optical distortion that made the target appear to be in a slightly different position than its actual location. Additionally, the crosswind that she had identified earlier was now more pronounced as the afternoon progressed. But Emma had discovered something else that none of the others had considered. During the practice weeks, they had always shot during morning hours when conditions were different. The afternoon sun angle was creating shadows and light patterns that affected depth perception and target clarity in subtle but significant ways. Most importantly, Emma realized that everyone had been making the same fundamental error. They were aiming exactly where they had been taught to aim during practice sessions, without accounting for the changed environmental conditions. The solution required not just technical shooting skills, but the ability to adapt and think analytically under pressure. As Emma walked toward the firing line, she felt surprisingly calm. The quiet confidence that had always been part of her personality was now serving her well. She had always been comfortable being different from her peers, and this situation was no exception. Emma's background was quite different from most of her fellow trainees. She had grown up in a small mountain town where self-reliance and problem-solving were part of daily life. Her father had taught her to think through problems systematically, whether they involved fixing a broken appliance or understanding a complex math concept. Her mother, the school teacher, had instilled in her a love of learning and the patience to observe before acting. Emma had always been the student who would watch others make mistakes before attempting something herself, learning from their errors rather than repeating them. This analytical approach had served Emma well throughout her life, but it had also made her appear shy or lacking in confidence to casual observers. Teachers sometimes had to encourage her to participate more in class discussions, not because she didn't know the answers, but because she preferred to be certain before speaking. Her decision to apply for the marksmanship program had surprised her parents. Emma had never shown interest in shooting sports or military activities. However, she had been intrigued by the technical aspects of ballistics and the mental discipline required for precision shooting. She saw it as an intellectual challenge as much as a physical one. During the 3 weeks of training, Emma had approached marksmanship like she approached everything else in life. She studied not just the mechanics of shooting, but the science behind it. She read additional materials about meteorology and how atmospheric conditions affected projectile flight. She practiced visualization techniques and worked on developing the mental concentration required for consistent accuracy. While other trainees focused primarily on the physical aspects of shooting, Emma had been developing a comprehensive understanding of all the variables involved. She understood that successful marksmanship was as much about reading conditions and making calculations as it was about holding steady and squeezing the trigger. Now, as she prepared to take her shot, Emma felt that all of her preparation and observation were coming together. She had identified the problems that had caused everyone else to fail, and she believed she knew how to compensate for them. The other trainees watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism as Emma settled into her shooting position. Some were silently rooting for her to succeed, hoping that at least one person from their group would qualify. Others had resigned themselves to failure and were simply going through the motions of watching the final attempt. Sergeant Williams observed Emma's preparation with interest. Her setup was deliberate and methodical, but different from what he had taught. She was making adjustments to her position and sight picture that seemed to account for factors that the others had ignored. Emma's breathing was slow and controlled. Unlike the nervous, rapid breathing that had affected several of the previous shooters, she had achieved the calm, steady rhythm that was essential for accuracy. Her grip on the rifle was firm but not tense, and her body position reflected the natural stability that came from proper biomechanics rather than forced rigidity. Most notably, Emma was taking significantly longer to prepare her shot than any of the previous trainees. While others had seemed eager to get their attempt over with, Emma was carefully working through her mental checklist and making fine adjustments to account for the conditions she had observed. The range fell silent as Emma settled into her final shooting position. Even the wind seemed to pause as she aligned her sights and began her final breathing sequence. The next few seconds would determine not just Emma's individual success, but the reputation of the entire program and everyone involved in it. Sergeant Williams found himself holding his breath as Emma's finger found the trigger. After 21 consecutive failures, the pressure on this single shot was enormous. Everything depended on whether this quiet, unassuming girl from Colorado could accomplish what none of her more vocal and confident peers had been able to achieve. Emma Rodriguez took a deep breath and settled into her final shooting position. The weight of the rifle felt familiar in her hands after 3 weeks of training, but today everything was different. The pressure was immense, but her mind was clear and focused. She had identified 3 critical factors that everyone else had missed. First, the afternoon heat was creating a mirage effect that made the target appear about 2 inches to the left of its actual position. Second, there was a subtle but consistent crosswind that required a windage adjustment of approximately 1 minute of angle to the right. Third, the lighting conditions were creating an optical illusion that made the center of the target appear lower than it actually was. Emma made her sight adjustments accordingly, moving her point of aim to compensate for all 3 environmental factors. This put her aiming point in a location that would look completely wrong to anyone else watching, but she trusted her analysis and observations. Her breathing settled into the slow, steady rhythm she had practiced countless times. Unlike the rushed attempts of her fellow trainees, Emma took her time, waiting for the perfect moment when all the variables aligned. The crosswind had a pattern, shifting slightly every few seconds, and she waited for the optimal window. The silence on the range was complete. Even Sergeant Williams found himself unconsciously holding his breath as Emma's finger slowly pressed the trigger. The shot broke clean and smooth, and the crack of the rifle echoed across the valley. "Hit!" called the spotter, his voice filled with surprise and excitement. "Center of the bullseye!" The group of trainees erupted in cheers and applause. After 21 consecutive failures, someone had finally hit the target. Sergeant Williams felt a wave of relief wash over him, but Emma was already settling in for her second shot. "Wait," Sergeant Williams said, stepping forward. "Emma, you've qualified. 1 hit is all you need to pass." Emma looked up from her rifle scope with quiet determination. "Sergeant, I'd like to complete the full 5-shot string if that's okay." Sergeant Williams was puzzled but nodded his approval. The standard qualification required only 3 hits out of 5 shots, and Emma had already achieved 1 perfect bullseye. There was no need for her to continue, but something in her calm confidence suggested she had more to show. Emma settled back into position for her second shot. She checked her environmental observations again, noting that the wind pattern had remained consistent and the mirage effect was unchanged. Her second shot broke just as smoothly as the first. "Another bullseye!" the spotter called out, his excitement growing. The crowd of trainees was now completely focused on Emma's performance. They had gone from skeptical observers to enthusiastic supporters in the span of 2 shots. Marcus Henderson, who had been so confident earlier in the day, was staring at Emma with genuine amazement. Emma's third shot followed the same deliberate process. She waited for the optimal wind conditions, made her precise sight adjustments, and delivered another perfect shot to the center of the target. 3 for 3, all in the X-ring, the spotter announced. Sergeant Williams was now watching with professional fascination rather than just relief. In his 25 years of instruction, he had never seen a performance like this, especially under such pressure. Emma was not just hitting the target, she was placing each shot with precision that exceeded what he typically saw from experienced competitive shooters. The fourth shot was equally impressive. Emma's consistency was remarkable, and her ability to read and compensate for the environmental conditions was demonstrating a level of skill that went far beyond what the 3-week course had taught. As Emma prepared for her 5th and final shot, Sergeant Williams realized he was witnessing something special. This was not just a successful qualification. This was an exceptional display of marksmanship that would be talked about for years to come. Emma's final shot completed a perfect 5-shot group, with all bullets clustered tightly in the center of the bullseye. The spotter called out the score. Perfect score, 4,200 points. The advanced scoring system used at Camp Meadowbrook awarded points based on proximity to the center of the target, with maximum points available for shots in the X-ring. Emma had achieved the maximum possible score of 4,200 points for her 5-shot string. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Sergeant Williams had experienced in his career. The other trainees, who just minutes before had been devastated by their own failures, were now cheering enthusiastically for Emma's success. Her achievement had somehow redeemed the entire day and restored everyone's faith in the program. Marcus Henderson was the first to reach Emma as she stood up from the firing line. "That was incredible," he said, shaking her hand vigorously. "How did you do that when none of us could even hit the target once?" Emma smiled quietly, still processing what had just happened. "I just watched and learned from everyone else's attempts," she explained. "You all helped me figure out what adjustments were needed." Jennifer Kim approached with tears in her eyes. "You saved our whole group," she said gratefully. "If you hadn't succeeded, we would all be going home as failures." Sergeant Williams walked over to Emma with the expression of professional respect and curiosity. "Emma, I need to understand what you did differently. In all my years of instruction, I've never seen anything like that performance." Emma explained her observations about the mirage effect, the crosswind patterns, and the lighting conditions. As she described her analytical process, Sergeant Williams realized that she had demonstrated not just exceptional shooting skills, but also the kind of environmental awareness and adaptability that marked truly gifted marksmen. "You identified problems that I hadn't even noticed," Sergeant Williams admitted. "Your approach to reading conditions and making adjustments was more sophisticated than what we teach in advanced courses." The bus ride back to the main facility was completely different from what anyone had expected that morning. Instead of a somber group of disappointed teenagers, the trainees were energized and excited. Emma's success had transformed the entire experience from a failure into a triumph. More importantly, Emma's performance had taught everyone a valuable lesson about observation, analysis, and perseverance. While others had become frustrated and rushed their shots, she had remained calm and methodical, learning from each failure and building toward success. During the graduation ceremony that evening, Emma received not just her standard marksmanship certification, but also a special recognition for exceptional performance. Sergeant Williams presented her with an award that was rarely given, acknowledging her as the most outstanding trainee in the program's history. However, the real impact of that day went far beyond awards and recognition. Emma's quiet confidence and analytical approach had inspired her fellow trainees to think differently about problem-solving and perseverance. They had learned that success often comes not from natural talent or past experience, but from careful observation, thoughtful analysis, and the courage to act on your convictions. For Emma herself, the experience confirmed what she had always suspected about her own abilities. While she might not be the loudest or most confident person in any group, her tendency to observe, analyze, and think before acting was actually a tremendous strength. She had learned to trust her analytical mind and to have confidence in her unique approach to challenges. The story of that day at Camp Meadowbrook became legendary among marksmanship instructors and trainees throughout the region. It was retold countless times, always focusing on the quiet girl who had saved the day when everyone else had failed. But those who were there understood that the real lesson was about the power of careful observation, analytical thinking, and the courage to be different. Years later, many of the trainees from that group would go on to successful careers in military service, law enforcement, and competitive shooting. They would often credit that day at the shooting range as a turning point in their understanding of what it means to persevere under pressure and learn from failure. Emma Rodriguez herself went on to become a competitive shooter, eventually earning a spot on the national team and competing in international championships. But she always remembered that day at Camp Meadowbrook as the moment when she learned to trust her own unique abilities and to have confidence in her analytical approach to life's challenges. Sergeant Williams continued his career as a marksmanship instructor, but he never forgot the lessons he learned from watching Emma that day. He began incorporating more training on environmental awareness and condition reading into his courses. and he always told new instructors about the quiet girl who had demonstrated that sometimes the most unlikely person can achieve the most extraordinary results. The shooting range at Camp Meadowbrook still operates today, and there is a small plaque mounted near the 100-yard firing line. It simply reads, "In recognition of exceptional marksmanship and the power of careful observation." Those who know the story understand that it commemorates not just one remarkable afternoon, but a lesson about the importance of staying calm under pressure, learning from others' mistakes, and having the courage to trust your own analysis even when everyone else has failed. That day taught everyone present that success in marksmanship, as in life, often comes not from natural talent or previous experience, but from the ability to observe carefully, think analytically, and maintain confidence in your approach even when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. Emma Rodriguez had demonstrated all of these qualities in spectacular fashion, turning what could have been a day of complete failure into one of the most memorable successes in the history of Camp Meadowbrook.